The sun always seemed gentler in their little neighborhood. Ugoma and Adugo, two giggling girls with matching cornrows, raced barefoot across dusty paths on their way to school, laughter echoing behind them like bells in a forgotten song. Their bond was inseparable, braiding each other's hair, sharing roasted groundnuts after school, and dreaming of the futures they would one day build. They were both raised by single mothers, women hardened by life but softened by love. The girls clung to each other like sisters, their connection deeper than blood. School was more than books and exams for them. It was a shared world where they drew strength from each other. Ugoma always stood out for her quiet brilliance, while Adugo had a fire in her eyes that made people pay attention. They were two sides of the same coin. But as life would have it, time was already sharpening its knife, preparing to cut their journey in two. Their JSS 3 graduation was filled with promises. They swore they'd never lose touch, no matter what life threw at them. But promises made in youth often shatter in the face of reality. Years passed, and the day came when WAC results ushered them into different paths. Ugoma secured admission to study medicine at the University of Port Harcourt, her eyes filled with dreams of white coats and stethoscopes. Adugo, with more charisma than commitment, found herself in a polytechnic in Kaduna to study business administration. They parted with hopeful hugs and exchanged numbers. But time, distance, and circumstance have a way of stealing what was once dear. The calls became fewer, texts stopped coming, and eventually, silence settled in like dust on an old photograph. Neither of them knew that their destinies would soon collide again, violently, irreversibly. Adugo arrived in Kaduna with wide eyes and a heart too trusting for the city's shadows. The buzz of campus life wrapped around her like a whirlwind, freedom, noise, and temptation. At first, she tried to keep her head down, but hunger for validation and a fear of loneliness led her into the arms of a clique of older girls who wore designer clothes, spent weekends in hotels, and laughed at rules like they were jokes. They promised her a shortcut to the good life, just small fun, they said. The lectures became fewer. Night outings became routine. She missed tests, then exams, then school altogether. The news of her expulsion arrived not with a bang, but a numb whisper. Her mother's tears over phone felt like ice on her skin, but she had no courage to go back home. Shame buried her. Surviving became a skill. She got a job as a bar girl, slept in a cramped room behind the building, and lived day to day with no dreams in sight. Her once fierce eyes now carried exhaustion and secrets. Ugoma, on the other hand, grew into her name, Beautiful One. She was topping her class, quiet but deeply respected. Her professors admired her discipline, and patients began calling her Angel Document. Yet, despite the applause, she felt a strange emptiness inside. She often stared at old pictures of her and Adugo, wondering where her friend had gone. The numbers they had exchanged no longer connected. Her heart ached with nostalgia. Her world was growing, yet something inside her felt unfinished. She had no close friends. Her heart had been loyal to only one. Little did she know that in another state, Adugo had just met a man whose smile held danger, and whose hands would one day twist her fate violently toward Ugoma once again. Adugo met Kola on a rainy evening while serving drinks at the bar. He was older, flashy, and always had thick wads of cash. He smiled like he knew something the world didn't, and for a girl desperate for stability, he looked like a lifeline. He tipped big, talked soft, and didn't ask questions about her past. In less than 2 months, she had moved into his apartment. At first, he was tender, buying her clothes, promising marriage, calling her wifey in front of friends. But it didn't take long for the mask to slip. The first slap came after she asked where he had been all night. He apologized with a necklace. The second time, he broke her lip. The third time, she stopped counting. Fear became her pillow. She learned to tiptoe around his moods. But her body remembered the pain, and her heart began to whisper, run. Still, where would she go? Home was no longer home. Her past was too heavy, her future too foggy. She stayed, hoping each sunrise would come with peace. But it never did. Far away, Ugoma's life was blooming like a well-watered flower. She graduated with distinction, and was quickly retained at the teaching hospital in Enugu. It was there she met DK, a calm, grounded businessman who fell in love with her mind before her smile. He called her Nwanyam like it was sacred. They had a quiet wedding with only family and a few friends. A year later, Junior was born, her sunshine. Ugoma loved her job, but nothing grounded her more than coming home to DK's arms and Junior's giggles. Still, every now and then, she'd stare out the window and wonder where Adugo was, praying she was okay. Little did she know that fate was already setting the stage for the storm of her life. Adugo's days were filled with silence, and her nights with cries muffled into pillows. Kola had become a demon with no off switch. His fists ruled the house. Whenever he drank, his rage rose like a wave, crashing violently on her fragile body. Her eyes were always puffy, her arms bruised. The neighbors heard, but no one spoke. In Nigeria, silence often hides behind drawn curtains. One day, after a brutal beating that left her limping, she sat by the window and whispered a name she hadn't said in years. Ugoma. Her voice cracked with the weight of longing. That name had been her safe place, her childhood, her innocence. She didn't know where she was anymore, not just physically, but within herself. Her heart throbbed for an escape, but she had nowhere to run. She feared Kola would kill her one day. Still, she stayed, because sometimes, even a prison feels familiar when the outside world offers only uncertainty. Kola got a new job in Enugu and they relocated. It felt like a fresh start, but pain doesn't lose your address. The beatings continued, now worse. One night, he dragged her by the hair, flung her against the wall, and left her unconscious. The neighbors rushed her to the emergency room. Her body was limp, her face barely recognizable. The hospital bustled as nurses shouted for oxygen, and doctors tried to stabilize her vitals. Ugoma, who had been on a double shift, was resting in the call room when a nurse burst in, begging for help. "We need a senior doctor now, please." Ugoma didn't hesitate. She ran into the ER, gloves on, ready to save a stranger. But when she pulled back the bloodied curtain and looked down at the patient, her heart nearly stopped. Adugo, Ugoma froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, the ER lights blurred behind her tears. That face, swollen, bleeding, broken, was the same face that once laughed beside her under mango trees, shared biscuits during break time, and whispered dreams in the dark. "Adugo," she whispered, barely audible. She leaned in closer, ignoring the confusion of her colleagues. Her hands trembled as she checked the pulse, calling for a crash cart. Adugo's body was barely holding on, but her heart, barely, was still fighting. Ugoma barked orders, pushing emotion aside and letting the doctor in her take control. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, the monitor steadied. The worst was over, physically, as they wheeled her to recovery. Ugoma walked behind the stretcher in stunned silence. It wasn't just a patient. It was her. It was Adugo. And suddenly, all the years apart didn't matter. She was here. She was alive. And she needed saving again. The following morning, Adugo opened her eyes to a familiar voice calling her name. "Adugo, it's me, it's Ugoma." Her eyes fluttered. Recognition swelled up with guilt. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "Ugoma?" Her voice cracked, a dry whisper. "Is it really you?" Ugoma smiled gently, holding her hand. "It's me. You're safe now." Adugo sobbed uncontrollably, her body shaking. That name had been her hope, her anchor. For the next hour, she poured out her story between tears. Expulsion, the bar job, Kola's charm, the beatings, and the hopelessness. She had no one, nowhere to go. Ugoma sat silently, listening, heart-breaking with every word. Finally, Adugo whispered, "Please, don't let me go back to him. Please." Ugoma gripped her hand tighter. "You're not going back. I promise you." But promises are heavy when fate is still writing the next page, and Ugoma had no idea what this one would cost her. Later that evening, Ugoma sat beside DK on their living room couch, her hands locked tightly around a warm mug of tea she hadn't sipped. Her eyes were distant, her voice soft as she told him everything. How she found Adugo, the abuse, the fear in her eyes and her desperate plea. DK listened silently, occasionally nodding, his face unreadable. When she finished, there was a long pause. Then he said, "Bring her here." Ugoma looked at him, startled. "Are you sure?" she asked. "She has no one." "DK, but it's a lot to ask." He reached for her hand. "She's your friend. That's enough for me." That moment reminded Ugoma why she married DK. His kindness, his strength, his loyalty. With their 5-year-old son, Junior, sleeping soundly in his room, their home was peaceful, warm, and safe. She hoped, maybe, just maybe, this would be a place of healing for Adugo, too. Adugo arrived with a hospital bag and trembling hands. The moment she stepped into Ugoma's home, she was overwhelmed by the scent of family. Clean floors, children's toys, laughter in the walls. Junior peeked from behind the couch and gave her a curious look before scampering off. DK welcomed her with a handshake and a kind smile. It felt surreal. No shouting, no raised hands, no fear. She wanted to cry. Ugoma gave her the guest room, told her to rest and take her time. And she did. For the first time in years, Adugo slept without fear. Days turned into weeks. She cooked, cleaned, and helped with Junior. But each time she watched DK help Ugoma tie her headscarf or hug Junior tightly, something dark stirred in her chest. Envy began to poison her thoughts. And in the quiet of night, a single idea crept in. This life should have been mine. Adugo stood in the kitchen, watching DK pack Junior's lunchbox with so much care hurt to look at. The gentle way he wiped peanut butter off the boy's cheek, the way he called him champ, the way Junior clung to his leg in trust. These moments lit something in her, but not warmth. Hunger. This was a life she once dreamed back in secondary school, lying beside Ugoma and sharing stories of fairy tale futures. But it was Ugoma who had found it. Ugoma who had the loving husband, the beautiful child, the home that didn't echo with screams. The house didn't feel like a place of healing anymore. It felt like a window she couldn't enter through. At first, she dismissed the feelings, told herself she was just jealous and tired. But soon, jealousy turned into obsession. She started dressing differently. Tighter clothes, bright lipstick, when Ugoma wasn't home. She laughed more loudly at DK's jokes, always lingered when he walked past. And he noticed DK grew uneasy. At first, he thought it was his imagination. But then came the lingering glances, the way her hand brushed his arm too long, how she leaned too close when she laughed. One evening, she emerged from the bathroom in nothing but a towel and walked past him deliberately. He looked away sharply, jaw clenched. He began avoiding being alone with her. Still, he said nothing. Ugoma adored her friend. She spoke of her with such loyalty that DK didn't want to be the one to shatter that image. But the tension in the house had grown thick. That night, while Ugoma was at the hospital, Adugo entered the living room where DK sat watching the news. She leaned on the armrest beside him and whispered, "You deserve better than someone who's never home." DK stood up without a word. But in Adugo's eyes, something dark was just beginning to awaken. The next morning, DK drove Junior to school in silence, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel every time he thought of Adugo's words. "You deserve better." They rang in his head like a warning bell. He had tried to ignore the signs, convince himself it was harmless. But it wasn't harmless anymore. Not when his wife's best friend was now eyeing him like prey. He considered telling Ugoma, but the thought of hurting her, breaking her trust, kept him silent. Instead, he decided to limit his time at home when Ugoma wasn't around. For feelings he was too afraid to admit. In her twisted mind, it became proof that he wanted her to, just needed time to act on it. Ugoma remained oblivious, grateful to have her friend safe and under her roof. She often returned home late from hospital calls, kissed Junior goodnight, and curled up beside DK, thanking God for peace. But that peace was thinning like smoke. One evening, DK was in the kitchen, washing plates, when Adugo crept behind him. "You can keep pretending," she whispered, "but I know you want me." Dyke turned sharply, water dripping from his hands. "You need to stop this," he said, voice low and firm. "I love my wife. You're her friend. This can't continue." But Adugo only smiled. "If you don't want me, why haven't you told her yet?" Her voice was silk, dangerous. "Maybe it's because you know she won't believe you. Maybe it's because I'll tell her you tried to touch me first." DK's heart dropped. DK became a prisoner in his own home. Every room now held tension. He kept his distance from Adugo, yet her eyes followed him. Her presence lingered like smoke after fire. He began locking doors, avoiding even eye contact. At work, he found himself distracted, checking his phone constantly, afraid that at any moment she might twist the narrative and tear his life apart. At night, he lay beside Ugoma, staring at the ceiling, heart heavy with guilt. Not for anything he'd done, but for what he hadn't told her. Still, every time he tried to speak, Ugoma would smile and talk about how happy she was that her best friend was healing. The way her eyes glowed with peace made the truth feel like a loaded gun in his mouth. He was caught in a web, and Adugo was spinning tighter each day. Meanwhile, Adugo stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair, her mind racing. DK had made his choice, and it wasn't her. Fine. If she couldn't have him through charm, then she would take him through chaos. Her thoughts twisted into dark vines. If Ugoma was gone, the idea slid into her mind like honey laced with venom. She imagined herself comforting a grieving dyke, helping him with Junior, slipping into Ugoma's place as if she'd always belonged. The thought didn't horrify her. It thrilled her. That night, she searched the kitchen, heart thumping, hands trembling, until she found a small bottle of rat poison tucked in a dusty corner. She stared at it like it had whispered her name. Morning came slowly. She woke early, humming softly as she made breakfast. She crushed the pellets, mixed them into the egg sauce, and plated it with toast. Just as Ugoma walked in, dressed and ready for work, Adugo smiled sweetly and said, "Eat before you go. You've barely rested." But before the plate touched Ugoma's hand, her phone rang. It was an emergency at the hospital. The hospital call was urgent. A multi-vehicle accident had flooded the ER with trauma cases. Ugoma kissed Junior's forehead and waved goodbye to DK before rushing out, completely forgetting the plate of food Adugo had offered. "Keep it for me," she had said with a tired smile. "I'll eat it when I get back." Adugo's heart sank as the door closed behind her. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind so many times, but now the plan hung suspended in the air. What if someone else eats it? She hesitated, then carefully transferred the food into a covered plate and placed it on the kitchen shelf, tucked behind some bowls. She'd wait until Ugoma returned. That evening, the house returned to its rhythm. DK picked up Junior from school, bought groceries on the way back, and greeted Adugo with a polite nod as he unpacked the bags. Adugo smiled back, pretending to be helpful, her stomach churning. Later that evening, DK opened the kitchen cupboard in search of something light to eat for him and Junior. He spotted the covered plate and assumed Ugoma had kept it earlier for them. "Looks like she made something before rushing out," he murmured. Junior clapped his hands. "I'm hungry, Daddy." Without thinking, DK warmed the food, plated it neatly, and the two sat at the dining table. Adugo came out of her room just in time to see them taking the first bites. Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened to speak, but no sound came out. "What do I do?" She panicked, but it was too late. Minutes later, DK clutched his stomach, eyes wide with confusion. Junior cried out, falling to his knees. Then silence. Dead, heavy silence. Adugo stood frozen. Her plan had worked, but not the way she intended. Her heart began to scream. What have I done? The front door creaked open just as the last orange glow of evening disappeared. Ugoma stepped in, dropping her hospital bag with a sigh of exhaustion. "DK," she called. "Junior?" The silence was strange. Her brows furrowed. The TV was still on, playing an old cartoon. Plates sat empty on the dining table, one fork on the ground. Then she saw them. Her husband, slumped against a chair, mouth ajar. Junior curled beside him on the floor, lifeless. "DK?" she screamed, rushing forward. She shook him violently. "Junior, wake up, wake up." Panic surged through her. Her hands fumbled as she checked for a pulse. Nothing. She grabbed her phone and called the hospital. her voice cracking with each word. "They're not breathing. My husband and my son, they're not breathing." Tears poured down her face like a flood, choking her screams. She held Junior in her arms, rocking him, whispering his name over and over again like a broken prayer. But he didn't move. Adugo stood at the hallway entrance, frozen, her hands trembling. She hadn't meant for this. Not them. Not Dyke. Not that little boy who used to tug at her wrapper and call her Auntie Hugo. She began to sob silently, her legs wobbling. Then she saw the plate, the one she had poisoned, empty on the table, the one DK had served. A loud wail escaped her throat as she stumbled forward. "No, no, no. It wasn't meant for them," she screamed, dropping to the floor beside them. "Ugoma, I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Ugoma looked up, eyes bloodshot, face twisted in agony. "What did you say?" Adugo clasped her mouth, realizing too late what she'd revealed. "It wasn't meant for them," she whispered. But the words were already burning in the air. Ugoma rose slowly, staring at her, horror spreading across her face. And with shaking fingers, she reached for her phone again. Not called a hospital this time, but the police. The sirens pierced through the neighborhood just as Ugoma sat numbly beside the bodies of her husband and son. Blue and red lights danced across the walls as the police stormed in. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering, shocked at the scene unfolding in the once peaceful home. Officers stepped over the threshold and found Ugoma pointing a trembling hand at Adugo, who sat on the floor, rocking back and forth, muttering, "It wasn't meant for them. It was supposed to be her." The lead officer gave a subtle nod. Two female officers approached and pulled Adugo up by the arms. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She only looked at Ugoma with tear-streaked eyes and whispered, "Forgive me." But Ugoma turned away, clutching DK's wedding band in her palm so tightly it broke the skin. They let Adugo away in handcuffs, her head bowed in shame. As she stepped outside, flashes from the phones of bystanders captured her broken figure. A murderer, a traitor, a friend turned snake. At the station, she confessed everything, from the obsession to the poisoned meal. "I wanted her life," she said in a hoarse voice. "Not like this. I swear, not like this." The interrogating officer, hardened by years of lies, only shook his head. "You killed a 5-year-old child," he said coldly. "Nothing justifies that." Meanwhile, at the hospital morgue, Ugoma stood between two cold metal drawers, staring at the tags on her husband and son's toes. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, sobbing in a voice so raw it made the nurse beside her weep. Everything she had, her home, her love, her son, was gone. And it wasn't fate. It was betrayal. The kind that doesn't come from strangers, but from the ones you once called sister. The courtroom was cold, but the air burned with tension. Ugoma sat on the witness stand, her voice steady but eyes hollow. Her testimony cut deep. How she found her husband and son lifeless. How her best friend became her enemy. Adugo sat with her head bowed, shackled by more than just chains. Her lawyer made arguments for diminished responsibility, for trauma, for mental breakdowns. But nothing softened the reality. The jury saw the evidence. The poison bottle, the confession, the betrayal. As the judge read the guilty verdict, a gasp echoed through the room. Not surprise, but a weight of finality. Life imprisonment. No parole. The gavel struck like thunder. Ugoma closed her eyes. Justice had spoken, but there was no joy in it. Outside the court, journalists swarmed, cameras flashing. The world now knew their story. But Ugoma wasn't speaking to the world. She was trying to speak to herself, to make sense of the hole left behind. That night, she returned to an empty house. She stood in Junior's room for hours, eventually curling into his tiny bed and whispering lullabies into the silence. She had justice, yes, but not peace. Peace was something she would have to build, one breath at a time. In prison, Adugo aged quickly. The mirror showed sunken cheeks and tired eyes. Inmates avoided her. Some feared her. Others hated her. She spent most days in the prison chapel, not praying, just sitting. She began writing letters to Ugoma, none of which she sent. letters filled with apologies, memories, regrets. "I wanted your life because I thought mine was worthless," she wrote. "But I now understand you don't steal light, you become it." The letters were stained with tears and blood from chewed nails. Guilt was a wound she couldn't stop picking at. One day, she received a visitor. It wasn't Ugoma. It was a counselor who handed her a book on forgiveness. "You may never be free from this place," he said, "but you can stop building a second prison inside your heart." That night, Adugo cried harder than she ever had. Not for herself, but for the first time, for those she had destroyed. Ugoma resigned from the hospital a month after the trial. The corridors reminded her too much of that day. She moved to a quieter town near Nsukka and began volunteering at a home for abused women and children. There, she found a strange form of healing, not in medicine, but in listening, in holding someone's hand and saying, "You're safe now," the same way she once said it to Adugo. Her pain gave her empathy. Her scars gave her strength. The house was small, the town quiet, and the nights were easy to survive. She turned one of the rooms in her new house into a small studio, filled with Junior's drawings and DK's framed photos. It became her sanctuary. Every morning, she lit a candle in front of their photos. "I will live well," she would whisper, "for both of you." Years passed. Ugoma never replied to any of the letters Adugo sent from prison, but she kept them, each envelope tucked away in a box labeled "Wounds." One day, she finally opened one. The handwriting was shaky. "If there's a world after this life, I hope I'll be able to tell Junior I'm sorry." The words hit her like a storm. She cried for hours, not because she forgave, but because the pain was still alive, and that meant she was too. Healing, after all, isn't forgetting. It's remembering without bleeding. That night, Ugoma took the letters, walked to the hills outside town, and burned them under the stars. She watched the flames dance, ashes lifting like ghosts released from her chest. She whispered goodbye, not just to Adugo, but to the version of herself who carried hate like armor. Ugoma started a foundation in Junior's name, Little Lights. It became a safe haven for children rescued from abusive homes. Slowly, she was becoming whole again, not the same, but whole in a different way. People admired her strength, but she never called herself strong. "I'm just still here," she would say, and that was enough. One evening, while planting flowers in the garden outside the center, she found a small butterfly landing on her shoulder. She smiled through tears. "Hi, baby," she whispered. It was in these quiet, unexpected moments that she began to believe love doesn't die. It changes form. And sometimes it returns when you need it most. Adugo remained in prison. She no longer wrote letters. She taught other inmates to read instead. When asked why, she simply said, "Because light, no matter how small, still matters." On the anniversary of Junior's death, she fasted and lit a candle in her cell. It was all she could offer. Not redemption, not peace, but remembrance. She kept one drawing Junior had made her. Crayons on paper, a house with 3 smiling people. It was torn and faded, but it was her only glimpse of joy that wasn't fake. Every morning, she touched it and whispered, "I carry your names every day." It was her penance and her prayer. Years later, Ugoma stood before a small group of children at the Little Lights Foundation, reading them a story about kindness. One of the girls, quiet and bright-eyed, raised her hand. "Do you miss your son?" she asked. The question was innocent, but deep. Ugoma paused, placed the book on her lap, and nodded. "Every single day. But I carry him here," she said, placing a hand over her heart. "And when I help you, I feel him smiling." That night, she wrote her journal. "Some betrayals end lives, but they do not end love. I am not who I was, but I am still here. And tomorrow, the sun will rise." And it did.